Hello, I'm Fred Long here, and I'm going to do a constituent marking of John chapter 2, verses 1 and 6. And I'm just going to be making some notations on some interesting points of grammar while I mark up the text. So, to begin, we see a ke, and this ke is adding something to the narrative. So we'd have to look at, the previous context. Why is ke used to signal this sentence and what follows as connected to the other one? Now, we have then a dative of time. On the third day, a wedding occurred in Cana of Galilee. And while I'm translating that, I was marking up the Greek text. This is called a dative of time right there to begin with, and it does use a more marked second attributive position adjective construction. So I would be a little bit curious why that is. In other words, the third could have been squeezed in, pardon me, could have been squeezed in between the article and the noun itself. It could have been squeezed in right to there. So this is a way to bring a little bit more prominence to the thirdness, which may have to do why this episode is connected by the ke there. So that's a question mark. All right, so agamos occurred in Cana of Galilee. That's fairly straightforward. And then you come to the next sentence, and maybe I'll switch up pens here, although that's a big pen. I'll keep the small one there. In Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus. So I'm going to single underline the verb and subject, and then there's a genitive of Jesus was there. Now with there, a key, that's an adverb of location. So, and the mother of Jesus was there. The next sentence, verse 2, the connector there is a de. In fact, I can save myself a lot of time, and I'm going to just mark these conjunctions ahead of time right now.
There are police reported ahead.
And so here's all the kes, just to indicate connectors, conjunctions. And this will save me a little bit of time with the marking. Okay, so connectors are important to note. There they are. So moreover, so the de here is adding a distinctive development. So there's a distinctive development going on here. The story is progressing. And this is a verb, eklethe, and what you have, this is a verb kaleo, to call, third singular. Now what's interesting is that the subjects of this verb are both Jesus, single underlined, and his disciples. And the ke here is indicating a both and construction. So you're marking two subjects, and in English we translate both and. So both Jesus and his disciples were invited. They were invited into the wedding. So is kind of interesting, into the wedding. Now this third singular verb is working with a plural subject because you have Jesus and his disciples. So rather, I should say that's a third singular. So this third singular verb working with a plural subject, Jesus and his disciples, what that does is bring more prominence to Jesus as the main subject. So this kind of thing is discussed in Stephen Levinson's Discourse Features of the Greek New Testament. Okay, so there's some extra focus on Jesus there. Because his mother is there, and then he also was invited, and his disciples, into the wedding. The into, I think, is interesting spatially. So not just someone on the outside, but actually inside. So I find that preposition curious. And then in verse 3, we have a genitive absolute construction. That's a type of circumstantial participle which is a co-attending circumstance with the main verb. It's a subordinate clause, and here it's the wine having become the wine lacking. So that's literally what it means. The wine being deficient. So the wine being deficient or lacking, it's an aorist tense there. Having become lacking. So there's something that's occurred here. And then you have single underline, the mother of Jesus says to him. So already I'm starting to note a repetition. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So Jesus, who gets extra focus because he's the subject of the verb singularly, even though it's a plural subject. And then you have the mother of Jesus says to him. All right, so says to him is kind of interesting too, because this pros avton would be a dative case. Noun could signal the indirect object to whom something is done or said. So to use pros is marking something different. And in my Koine Greek grammar, I talk about that, suggest that pros is marking proximity and bringing that into some prominence. So that's worth thinking about. What's actually conveyed with that? Is there a pattern of John's use of this in his gospel and that kind of thing? It's a big study, but that could be done. All right. And then what does she say to him? Here we have a direct quotation, and it's simply, wine they do not have. The word order is a little bit odd. It's either stressing the do not have or the wine, and probably the whole thing is being stressed. So typically Greek has a verb is first, then the subject, then the object. Here you have the object first and then the verb. And when you move the object in front of the verb, that's usually putting it into some focus. But it can also put the verb last in the sentence. And that's one way that you can stress the verb, is by putting it last. So here we don't know what's causing what, whether the wine being missing or the verb not having it is at issue, or perhaps it's both. All right, so then you have and Jesus to her says. Now this is rather interesting, because it confirms the other construction of they're both in pink now, of how to represent the indirect object. Here the avte is using the dative case. Just earlier, Mary was speaking to him, pros avton, with the prepositional phrase. Once again, we see Jesus being repeated, and then he's kind of snarky here in what he says, which I put in brackets. So, what to me and to you, woman, literally. And it's an idiom, certainly. T is an interrogative pronoun. It's a verbless phrase. So what does it mean? Verbless clause. This is the kind of thing, though, that demons speak to Jesus in the synoptic gospels. They're like, what does our stuff have to do with your stuff? What do you have to do with me, and vice versa? So it's a bit of an idiom. I don't know what it means in this context, if it's a little bit snarky, standoffish. To me, there seems to be a little bit of a epistemic distancing, particularly because he calls his mom, who's well known as the mom of Jesus, he calls her woman. So what is meant by that? I'm curious. Like, seems to be kind of a hard statement. Now, he says, continuing on, I closed that off. He says, the direct speech continues, not yet has my time arrived, my hour. My hour not yet has arrived. This obviously relates to a theme in John's gospel. This may be the first instance of it. If so, that seems significant. So this is where, when you're doing this kind of work, you also need to know the discourse context. The more that you know the discourse context, the more you can provide, ask good questions and have potentially more insight what's happening. My hour is not yet. So to me, it seems like that's a big jump in logic. Like, why does his mom ask, noting the jars being empty, prompt him to push back about his hour? What is his hour? Is that his death? Is this a little bit of an anxious time for him? Like, no, not yet. Is he, here he is invited into the marriage, and she's talking about something that could lead more quickly to his death, or something like that. I don't know. What's the narrative logic? What are the gaps there? Is worth thinking about. Now, as we look at the next verse 5, we notice that there is no connector, which is a little bit odd. This is what's called a syndeton. How odd is it? That's the question. For Stephen Levinson and Stephen Runge, his student, PhD student, now they're both doctors, linguists, they argue that in John's Gospel, a syndeton, not having a connector, is the default. That's how John, if he doesn't do anything different, that's the normal way that he connects ideas. But one of our own Asbury students, Mara Reed, in my Discourse Greek Grammar class, produced a final paper, and she's actually presenting it in a couple weeks at a conference, challenging that and arguing that indeed that's not the default, but rather it's motivated. What that means is then that the normal functions of a syndeton need to be considered as why John uses it here. So one of the uses of a syndeton is indeed to mark a break, a kind of a break. And so I would suggest a kind of a break right there. So a little discourse break. So this is like another paragraph. His mother, Emeter Aftu Legi, says, and by the way, these are all historic presents. So what's the role of historic present in narrative discourse? That's something to look at. Again, Levinson and Runge, and I also have a discussion of their discussion in my Koine Greek Grammar. It's an ongoing scene, I think is what it means. It's an ongoing scene. So his mother says to the servants, there's the dative, indirect object again, rather than the pros. And what does she say to them? Here's the direct discourse. Whatever he says to you, dative, do. Do it. So whatever he says to you, do it. Now, this otian lege, I should say, umin, is a type of conditional sentence. It's a relative conditional sentence, whatever. And that on helps mark this as being a conditional sentence. And particularly the first part of this is called the protasis, the supposition. And so then we need to consider what kind of conditional sentence is this. Go to my Koine Greek Grammar, chapter 26, and I provide a very thorough overview of different types of conditional sentences. And I would classify this as what's called a present general condition, indicating that whatever it might be, ever, do it now. Do it. Just do it. And that's when you have the subjunctive with on and the supposition followed by a present tense or present time verb. And here the piesete, that command form, I'm taking as having the force of like a present tense time frame. So right in this circumstance, whatever it is, do it. Okay, so that's what she says to them. I'm wondering what Jesus is doing as he's standing there. Is he rolling his eyes? Is he fuming a little bit? This relates to, again, a discourse theme of Jesus with his family members, and how do they relate to him? His brothers want him to manifest himself also in Jerusalem. So I think that's in chapter 9 or 7. I don't know. So it's worth looking at that theme. Jesus and his family in John. Okay, so the last verse here we're going to look at. There were stone jars, six stone jars, according to the custom of the cleansing of the Jews, the Judeans, or the Judean officials, according to the cleansing of the Judean officials. I argue that the mention of the Jews in John's gospel most often refers to the Judean officials. You could look at my introduction to my Illustrated John in Greek that I co-created with Michael Halcomb. And in the introduction there, we talk about how we rendered this word iudeo in John's gospel. And I can't remember if we translate this as Judean officials right here, or authorities, but I would suspect so. So there were 6 stone jars according to the cleansing of the Judean, lying there. Now this is a participle from kami. It means to lie. This is feminine nominative plural. And there's the ending right there, kame. So this is probably what I would consider, not probably, it is a periphrastic participle construction. Now the genius of the periphrastic participle construction, look at my Koine Greek Grammar, chapter 19, I believe, is that it stresses the participle attribute as ascribed to the subject. And so here, the fact that they're lying here is being stressed. There could have been another way to make this statement. It could have used the imperfect tense. It could have used the aorist tense indicative. But to create this with a periphrastic construction places stress on the verbal attribute ascribed to the subject. So that's a question mark for me. Why use this construction to stress them lying there? Was that unusual? What's going on there? And then you have a final participle clause, koruse ana metretas duo et tris, containing upwards of 2 or 3 measures. All right, so this is an interesting odd detail. It's a circumstantial participle. It's feminine nominative. It's hanging off of the previous periphrastic participle construction. It's adding a circumstance. It's explaining more about the circumstance. So this is a post-positioned, post-nuclear circumstantial participle explaining more about the situation of these jars lying there. And so this is an odd, interesting detail. Why add this detail? Why is that detail important? Plus, it's adding quantitative specification, 2 or 3. Why not be more precise? Why not say 3 exactly? Why 2? This begins whenever there's numeric specification or qualification. I always ask why. Sometimes we know it's for emphasis to add everyone was there. That means everybody. That's adding a punch to it. Here, I'm curious why 2 or 3 measures. And at this point, when I'm working with the passage like this, I'm wondering what intertextuality exists, like what other implied reference are echoing from the Jewish scriptures. You have to look at the Septuagint, but also Jewish scriptures. 2 or 3. What does that numeric sequence mean? I mean, my initial guess, right, would be testimony, witnesses. So, is that a theme in John's gospel? Well, yeah, it actually is. John the Baptist is testifying to Jesus. So, is this John's way of saying in the narrative, these jars, what's going to happen to these jars is a testimony to Jesus? And actually, I'm talking myself into that interpretation. I think so, right? Because this is going to be the first miracle that Jesus performs, and it's 2 or 3 jars, and these 2 or 3 give testimony. It's not 1 jar, it's 2 or 3. I don't know, it's intriguing to think about. Well, a lot of ink has been spilt on this passage, so those are some thoughts, and I hope you found this helpful.